I'm Beth Perrell with Pat Rose, who is an aquatic biologist and the executive director of the Save the Manatee Club. I'm going to get right into it, Pat. You recently penned an opinion piece on your website. Manatee harassment case reinforces the needs for a hands-off policy. This is in response to that individual who carved the word Trump into the algae on the back of a manatee. I know I'm not the only Floridian that was horrified, but tell us a little bit more from your expertise as an aquatic biologist. What does this mean to the manatees, and what was the premise of your opinion piece?
Well, it's after a lot of actually more recent frustration. We really love that divers have an affinity for manatees. They want to see them and take, help them from a long-term care standpoint. But then there are those who want to abuse them. So we've seen the number of people diving and swimming with manatees go from a few thousand a year to hundreds of thousands a year. And so with that, you're going to get some bad apples and people that take advantage of it. Many years ago, probably 30 years ago, when I was heading the state of Florida's programs for manatee research and management, we passed laws to protect manatees from actually being given water and food in order because it real changed their behavior. At the time, we could have prevented them from being touched. It's always been illegal to harass them, but we left it so that if a manatee approached a diver and came right up to them, they could put one open hand up, and if that manatee came all the way to them, they could just touch it without scratching it, without rubbing it, without manipulating or trying to ride it, all that. But that's really gone to the point when there were just a few thousand a year happening to hundreds of thousands. So now some have taken it to that extreme where they begin to manipulate those few manatees that do come up to people and can actually do them harm.
Tell me a little bit more about that. I see sort of the behavioral training aspect of it, that you're encouraging the manatee to trust and maybe come closer. But is there anything going on with the physiology of the manatee at that moment? Because I think about stress, perhaps, of somebody scraping on your back. So what's going on?
Yeah, let's start out by why would a manatee even be there in that situation in the first place? There's sort of two scenarios. One, bear in mind, they're there in the springs to stay warm in the wintertime. And so they're already being stressed by the cold. They need to rest and relax and recuperate, basically. And so in this case, we don't know if it was one manatee that wanted to be around a person, or if in fact it's looking even like this may be more of the idea is that it was a cold stressed manatee that was already having difficulty because it came in late during the winter. It still had barnacles on it. It could have been that they literally restrained the animal who was weak and took first of all, it looked like their hand, and they scratched those letters in, and they may have even followed up with, say, a credit card or something. I don't think it literally penetrated the manatee's skin, but it certainly caused it discomfort, and it likely stretched it out and could have caused it then to have to leave that warm water. And it pushes them out of the protected areas where they are into boat traffic and to colder water, and that can have very serious consequences.
Have you seen examples of that, by the way, that you could share with us?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of scratching people's initials in. It has happened now and then, maybe one letter or something like that. And certainly it's been frowned upon. But in this case, I'm concerned they really took grave advantage of a stressed manatee that was already too stressed. And then in this case, good, we had an adverse reaction to it. But many times people are posting their swimming trips with manatees, and they're really rubbing them, twisting them around, if you will, doing the things that would encourage them again to become more accustomed to people. And if the person is caring, maybe there's not a serious injury being done there. We have seen examples where people have taken pretty severe advantage of manatees. For example, we had in the past where young calves were actually taken out of sanctuaries and held so that the swim group could come up on the tour guides, and each of those take a chance of petting them. And the little manatee was literally constrained. And that's teaching people the very wrong message. In other cases, we've even seen for many years ago, thankfully not recently, a manatee with a rake in its back. So if they'll come up and keep coming to people, they can be abused by those who want to abuse them. There were also instances, for example, where some young men in a boat had a gig to to gig frogs and other creatures or fish or flounder and gigged right in the mouth, the face of a manatee. And so that's another example where some people they're going to come up to, for example, and they're just curious, but others they come up to them and they can really be inflicted great harm to them. And that's not a good thing. They need to be left alone to rest and recuperate and not be attracted to people.
And the manatee isn't really going to hurt the human, right? It's not really a threat to the human. It's really the opposite direction.
Yeah, unlike many other actual marine mammals, which manatees are marine mammals, they're probably the most docile, the most benign creature you can imagine. They're just not really capable of being aggressive, even under the circumstances where a female manatee and her calf, and someone was trying to hurt the calf. The most that would happen is that mother manatee would swim between the calf and the abuser. They're not going to attack under any circumstance. Could a manatee hurt you accidentally if the circumstances arose? And that becomes apparent when sometimes as scientists we have to catch the manatees for their own health and to rescue them and rehabilitate them. People have been hurt during that time. For example, a person's leg broken and so forth. So they're a very strong, powerful animal, but they're just not capable of aggression. They're probably the most benign, creature on Earth in that respect, and they need our protection because they literally evolved in a way they didn't have to develop defenses as other predators might.
So when it comes to hands off, there's probably two things going on. And the first is what you're getting at, which is simply education. I think they are so adorable that people want to reach out and pet them and love on them, and that's not the right thing to do. And then the second is maybe the concept of some kind of regulation.
Well, I think it's come now time. Every other marine mammal is not allowed to be touched. Manatees, and actually I have to admit I had some role in that because back 35 years ago or so, I had the opportunity as the head of those programs to literally make it illegal to touch them under any circumstance. It was always illegal to harass them or to take them or do the kinds of things we've talked about with scraping in the letters on their back. But it wasn't illegal if the manatee approached that person and they had the one open hand. That was a policy we accepted, but we're far past that now. Every marine mammal needs to be protected from humans trying to touch them or grab them or ride them or chase them and all those other things that can ensue. And sadly, it may take some individuals a little bit away from them, but we've actually been working with some of the guides to implement this already on a volunteer basis. And there are 2 operators that have done that. They haven't lost any business. The people come away from those trips actually better informed and have more of a caring concern for manatees than those who are trying to touch them and say, leave that experience and say, did I get to touch a manatee? Well, we'd rather have them leave if they're going to have the experience and said, did a manatee touch you, for example? We don't really are not trying to encourage the manatees to touch them, but better if that happens on an occasion that it be the manatee doing the touching and not the person doing the grabbing.
Now, so to be clear, in relation to that, if you're in the water, and this has happened to me, a manatee goes by, there's not even much of a wake. You may not even notice. So if the manatee runs into you, it's not your fault.
Yeah, about the worst thing that could happen is if you allowed a manatee, which happens on occasion, they're very tactile. They have the prehensile upper lips where they can grab onto vegetation. They might chew on a rope, and you have to be careful with that too. And so if someone had their hair and they allowed the manatee to begin to grab their hair, and then someone alarmed that manatee, scared it might jerk away very rapidly. They're so powerful and they have a lot of mass and momentum. They could harm someone, not because they wanted to, because it would be an accident.
So what is required, or what would be the process for having a regulation, enacting a regulation that prevents people from touching?
Yeah, there's 2 ways that it could be done. One would be under the Manatee Sanctuary Act in the state of Florida, where we would basically write a rule that would say, hands off, you're not allowed to touch a manatee. Probably going to have also have some kind of a standoff distance where you're not approaching it too close, because then you're going to cause that potential harm and harassment to the manatee as well. The other, it can happen under the federal law. There are two federal laws that would be relevant to that. Probably the most relevant would be the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And as I said earlier, virtually every other marine mammal, it's already illegal to touch them. And so it'd be a simple matter really of modifying the existing federal law for marine mammals to make it illegal to touch them. And in fact, the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission has recommended that that happen. So we're going to follow up and coordinate with them closely on this and try to go ahead and move forward with those rules and make it illegal. It won't be, we're not trying to make it illegal to swim with them, but we want to make it illegal to actually physically touch them, and to, of course, cause them harm is already illegal, but these things can happen unintentionally, and that should also be controlled.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a couple of maybe off-topic things that I think relate to this, but one of them is on your website, and it's an article about a manatee who had a tire.
Yes.
Like a bike tire around it. And so something I see as related is that we're also doing things that really make it dangerous for the manatee, even outside of boating.
Right. Well, in fact, that's an example of people discarding things into the environment, whether we've had manatees also eat plastic bags, for example. We've had them eat fish hooks. And so manatees have died as a result of both plastic bags being consumed along with the vegetation. Being that they're vegetarians, they're going to be grazing around. They're ingest fishing line, fishing hooks. For example, they also have that fishing line wraps around their pectoral fins, and they have, manatees have two close to the front of their body. And so there are a lot of different ways that the trash and discarded items from people get into the water, and they cause literally great harm and sometimes death to manatees.
And deaths to the manatees. I'd like you to talk about the mortality rate. How are things going right now?
Well, it's not looking that great. We ended up with, I think, 639 as a total mortality for 2020. Sadly, we've already had 66 manatees verified dead already just in this first 19 days of January. And there's probably a few more that didn't make the list yet. We also have had already a significant number of rescues that were necessary. We had almost, I think, 120 something rescues where manatees, thankfully, were, boaters and others that carrying people called in and reported the animal that was either sick or injured and rescued. It's part of the Manatee Rehabilitation Partnership, which we're one of those founding members. We work with the Fish and Wildlife Commission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and several of the ocean area that in our state and out of state to help rehabilitate and get those manatees back out into the wild. But we're seeing not only more deaths, but also the need to rescue more.
What's going on? I mean, why this huge number already this year?
Well, manatees face a lot of different serious threats to them. So maybe we start with, since it's wintertime, cold stress. So a significant number of those we've already seen this year are dying from cold stress because their metabolic rate of a manatee is really fairly low. And so they have to stay in water that's, say, at least 68 degrees or above. Our springs are about 72 to 73 degrees. So those become really important winter refuges for manatees. And that's where we have to balance the protection for the manatees. And of course, then people want to see them. So we've got to make sure there's room for the manatees to stay warm. And then on occasion, if they want to come out and seek out a person, then without harassing, that can be done. The power plants in the state of Florida, there's several that produce warm water as a result of production of electric energy. So when steam is produced, then it has to be brought back to water. So they use the water in the bays and rivers that they're in, and that reduces that steam back to water so they can recirculate it, but that produces heat, and the manatees come to that. And most of those are pretty well protected for the manatees, but it also, let's take the next one, boating. So that's very significant. We had essentially 3 for sure years of record mortality increasing year after year. In 2020, we won't know because there were many manatees that died, and likely several of those that died from watercraft, but because they weren't necropsied due to a combination of COVID and also cutbacks from a budgeting standpoint for the Fish and Wildlife Commission, we just don't know why they died, but we can pretty much understand from the amount of manatees, the number of manatees being injured by boating, and together with what ones we knew were killed by watercraft, that was substantially higher than what was reported. Then you have issues like red tide. So hundreds of manatees can die from red tide, has happened in certain key years, and 2018 was one of those where we had more than 200 manatees die from red tide. Let's say, for example, in 2010, going back a bit, we had 200 plus manatees die from cold stress. So what's happening is you add each of these different mortality factors together. Not any one during 2020 was hugely out of whack, but they all added together because they were all significant risks to the manatees.
So that is a lot. And how does the Save the Manatee Club approach trying to deal with all of those factors that are increasing the mortality rate?
Well, we work with our partners. If it's rescues, then we're working with the Fish and Wildlife Commission and Service to get them rescued, with our partners in the ocean area to give them care and help them recuperate and be rehabilitated. If it's red tide, for example, that's a tough one because it's a naturally occurring organism, but it's actually being exacerbated by the amount of pollution that's coming into our nearshore waters. It originates offshore, but once it gets established inshore, it can actually be more prevalent and persistent. And so the reporting of that, again, rescues are important. If you can get to a manatee suffering from brevetoxin toxicity and get it into a caring facility in a matter of probably 7 to 14 days, it can be cleansed of the toxins and it can be released fairly soon back to the environment. But if not, essentially paralyzes the manatee and it drowns. And so that's a really serious issue. And it can, again, be hundreds in a given year if that's out of control. For example, one of the other things that's starting to have a problem for manatees again are water control structures. We've had a lot of rain in Florida, and historically, those water control gates and dams and locks, they can crush manatees and drown them. And so many of those were retrofitted in order to have devices similar to what you'd have with an elevator, where if it starts to close on it, it will open back up, but they don't always work the way they're supposed to. We had a recent case in the Miami area where a manatee got its head into one of the gates there and it literally crushed its skull. It drowned, and we're looking into that more carefully. In fact, I have a call today at 1 o'clock where I'll be talking with the head of both the research and the management functions for the state of Florida, the Fish and Wildlife Commission, to talk about our concern about such a high percentage of manatees not being necropsied. So we don't know why they're dying, and there are serious issues. In Brevard County alone, there are more than 100 manatees that died. There have been already, I think, almost 20 this year. And there's some serious problems going on. Without that better science and understanding, we can't necessarily know exactly what should happen with that. And in fact, unfortunately, there are going to be adversaries of manatee protection that if you don't have the strong science to deal with and back up what rules are necessary, they begin to erode as if you don't have the necessary information to substantiate the needs for those protections. So I went on a little bit, but it's kind of case after case. We have to be very vigilant about protecting manatees. And then the last one I'll just say, our aquatic ecosystems are under severe pressure from pollution as well. We've had large thousands of acres of seagrass lost. We have brown tides, we have red tides, we have blue-green algal blooms. And so there's some really serious problems facing the entire aquatic ecosystems too.
So, that's a lot, Pat.
I'll try to break it up in order.
Yeah, let me try to go over a couple of things you mentioned, and it just actually let's begin with one thing so that people understand where you're coming from. You said manatees drown, and I think a lot of people think, well, they live in the water. How can they drown?
Right. So in the one case, if you're pinned by a water control structure, both either by the pressure of the gate itself or by the pressure of the water flowing through and pinning that manatee up against that, sometimes they just can't get away. And so we have to find ways to solve that. And we found pretty good ways to do it, but you have to stay up with it. And then the more times those gates open and close, the risks are there. You take a brevetoxin situation from red tide, that literally paralyzes the manatee. It's hard for them to breathe. It's hard for them to swim. And so they literally are paralyzed and will sink under, and they hold their breath maybe 20 minutes or so, but beyond that, that's going to be it. They're going to drown.
The science that needs to take place. So is it a funding issue? What is preventing it? And if there was, one science study that you could undertake, what would it be? What needs to happen right now?
I don't think it's one science. We have to deal with and address each of these risk factors together, singularly, but then all together. One of the things we did do going back many years where we worked to develop what are called manatee protection plans. So it deals with everything from protecting the warm water sources, making sure manatees have a place to be safe during the winter there, the speed limits in order to give manatees a chance to, again, not to be run over by high-speed boats or literally killed in that respect. But Florida is a big state, and there are hundreds of thousands of miles collectively of our waterways, and really a small percentage of those are regulated to boat speeds, but they're the most important places. So and then if you don't have the enforcement of the existing zones, then it's like you don't have a manatee protection zone if you don't have that. So we need better law enforcement. We need more enforcement in order to protect both manatees and the boating public. We're looking at in the future, for example, with sea level rise and climate change and just trying to be better about our environment, our power plants are likely going to be going offline in the future and replaced with other sources. If we haven't come up with a plan to transition manatees' dependence on those artificial warm water sources before that happens, then we're going to lose thousands of manatees due to cold stress if that happens. Same time, we have to protect our springs and the spring flow and our aquifer, because that's where the warm spring water comes from. It's not warm in the summer, but in the winter, it's critically warm for manatees because it stays 73 degrees year round. But there are a tremendous number of permits that have been issued to pump that groundwater out. And so it's really a major battle that we're fighting to hold on to those spring flows, not only for manatees, but all the other creatures and wildlife that depend on the springs as well. I'll pause with that because I don't know.
Well, yeah, so no, that's great. To all of the things you were talking about, what you left with, talking about the grasses, talking about the springs just now. I mean, these are things that take years to do anything about. So you're up against a deadline in terms of helping the manatees really long term. And that's a scary concept, isn't it?
It is, in fact, and it's especially important because Florida is not just stationary. It's growing in terms of human development. So all the problems that are already exacerbated and cause direct risk and harm to manatees, most of them are actually getting worse now. So we had to go through in 2017 where political pressures was put to downlist manatees from endangered to threatened, principally because we did have more manatees after 40 some years of good hard work and very constructive partnerships that put protections in place. But now really that was premature because we were seeing on the horizon the sea level rise problems. We're seeing the increases in pollution. We were seeing the increases in brown tides, blue-green algal blooms, and problems with the aquatic ecosystem. We knew there was going to be a huge future issue with what's going to happen to the power plants. And so really the Endangered Species Act, as it's written, required that those risks and threats have been under control for today and would be under control for the foreseeable future. Instead, they took just the sheer number of manatees being better, and they made a decision that they were well enough off to now downlist them. Well, one of the things I try to impress upon people is when the problems are actually getting worse, not better, that's not the time to take them down a rung on the endangered species list. It's a time to ensure that you have protected both the animals themselves that exist within the population, and you've protected their aquatic ecosystems that they depend on. And if you don't do that, you won't have the same kind of recovery potential that we had going back to the 1960s and 70s and even the 80s, because what habitat was available to them then is not available to them today. And so if we lose this thousands of manatees going forward, we'll probably never recover them. So we're really at that point where we still have quite a few more manatees than we did in the beginning, but we don't have so many that we can lose thousands and still have them persist to the long term.
Would you say that if manatees are being affected by these things now, it's just us later? Like,
Oh, well, in fact, we are the principal problem. So uh, if you like to fish, for example, the fishing grounds and the nursery areas for the fish that you might want to cape, that's going to affect you. Red tide, if you want to enjoy the beaches and you don't want to have masses of dead fish there or stinging in your eyes from the brevetoxins that are being blown by the wind and so forth. If you want to have quality drinking water, if you even want to have enough drinking water. These are all issues that manatees are kind of that canary in the coal mine, if you will. They're warning us ahead of time that these problems are getting worse. And so it doesn't mean we don't stop growing and developing in the state of Florida and try to make things better, which we need to do, but we have to do it sustainably. So any future development we do should be done with an eye that this is sustainable with where we are today and what the world's going to look like in the future. It means we have to do a better job of cleaning up the pollution that we've already caused, and then do less as we move forward and do it in a way that's smart and fits with that ecosystem, because we as individuals, our quality of life will suffer, our health will suffer if we don't do that, along with all those animals and plants that depend on those same aquatic healthy ecosystems.
people can learn more on your website, savethemanatee.org. Also, on your website, people can learn about adopting a manatee for February as a Valentine's gift.
So,
Tell us, yeah, what are your final thoughts? What else would you like to tell us about?
well, we would love them to go to our website. We do have a wealth of information there that's available that can help them. And we'd love them to sign up for our action alert system, because we do count on people being a part of the solution too. Man himself is part of the problem, but it's going to take caring people to be a part of that solution. And in fact, a great way is to give a gift, for example, of a manatee adoption. Right now, we're doing a special for Valentine's Day, and they should be able to find that on our website. And of course, it's savethemanatee.org, pretty simple. And we just encourage people to learn more and join in. And we certainly, again, appreciate all the different folks. We work closely with the educators and school children and so forth. We've got different videos and even live sessions that we can do with classrooms. So if there are teachers that, look us up too, because we want to help work with you and your students in your classroom. So I just want to reemphasize that we not only need to be able to be responsive and count on boaters, for example, reporting a sick or an injured manatee, but people who also live along the waterways. But also think about those things that you might think you're helping a manatee out by giving it some lettuce or feeding water with a hose or touching the animal. Those are the kinds of things that you might do because you think you are loving it, you're helping it, but really you're setting it up for harm. Sadly, there are other people who will take advantage of manatees as well. So we'd ask people to resist that urge to give them food or water or to pet them or grab them, because in the long run, that's not going to help them. And we'd rather have folks look at them passively from a distance and appreciate them and be a part of the long-term solution.
Pat Rose is an aquatic biologist and executive director of the Save the Manatee Club. One more time, that's simply savethemanatee.org online. I'm Beth Perrell.